your mic off and your cameras off as well. And I think we can start since it's 02. In the meantime, we will see that the others will join. We will admit them as well. So hello, everyone. My name is Ardita Zmani, and I'm the head of the event team at European Guanxi. Today, I will moderate the event that will be centered on feminism in China, a closer look to the Hui communities. We will better understand, thanks to the presentation of Professor Jaschok, how feminism from the margin works, looking in particular to the experience of the women of the Hui community in China. So we choose this theme on International Women's Day, which is tomorrow, just to give space and voice to underrepresented communities. And thanks to the long experience in the field of professioning today, of the professor that we have today, we will have the opportunity to learn more about women's religion communities in China. So it is a pleasure to be here and welcome our speaker, Professor Maria Jaschok. She is a senior research associate of the Contemporary China Studies program at Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, and also a member of the steering committee of Masters in Women's Gender Sexuality Studies in Humanities. Her research interests are in the areas of gendered constructions of memory, feminist and oral ethnography, innovative research methodologies, and uses of oral history in the writing of women's history in Asian contexts. She has conducted collaborative research projects in Central China since 1994, especially addressing issues and the implication of growing female membership of religions for local citizenship and civil society. So Professor Jaschok will present the most salient aspect of the topic for around 30 minutes today. Then all of us will have the chance to ask any question related to the topic. In order to ask the question, I kindly ask you to send a private message directly to the account named European Guanxi using the chat box. And I ask you to specify whether you prefer to directly ask the questions by turning your microphone and camera on, or letting me, the moderator, take charge of the question. And then after that, Professor Jaschok will answer your questions. So stay with us until the end, because your thoughts of the topics really matters for us. And before leaving the floor again to Professor Maria Jaschok, I just remind you once again to turn your mic off and cameras off. Now I leave the floor to the Professor Jaschok, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your good introduction. Thank you for organizing this so efficiently. That's great. And thank all of you, people invisible to me. And I was just saying, I wish I could see you all. We could engage face to face, for inviting me into your space on the eve of International Women's Day. And I'm very happy to be able to contribute some of my area of work in the region I'm working in, East Asia, China in particular, and well, the many years of research that I have conducted. So I hope you will find that informative and interesting. And you will have to stop me after 30 minutes because there's so much to say and to share. So I will use a PowerPoint presentation in part to sort of structure what really sort of enormous amount of information I want to give, but also to give you a visual and audio evocation of the fieldwork, the research, and the part of China, central China, where I am, have conducted most of my work. So if you bear with me, I will share the screen. Hopefully it will all be as it should be. Yeah, is that so far okay?
It's perfect. We can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll start. When I was invited to talk about feminism, feminist history in China, I sort of immediately had to respond by saying, happy to do so, glad to do so, but it's coming from a perspective of margin. And that is, my interest has been less focused on mainstream feminism or its diversity, and I'll give a little bit of context on that, but has been much more engaged with intersectionality, religious identity, religious agency, and socioeconomic and other disadvantages. So it's a feminism from the margin that at the same time helps to query mainstream feminist accounts. And I'll hopefully, let me see. I'm just trying to see if I can move to the next slide. I seem to have a bit of a technical issue here.
Yeah, okay, great, it works now.
Got it, yeah, it's fine now, okay. And before I start, we're talking the eve of International Women's Day, two rather sobering notes. One that's just come from Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, who, when he relates to the forthcoming International Women's Day, talks about gender equality as going ever more distant, and putting to us that it may take at least 300 years or so, because before anything such as gender equality can be imagined and reached, because of, and then the litany of issues and backlash and populist backlash that I think, I thought I'd sort of put right at the beginning. It's a rather sort of sobering, mood, which I start off with that. And from the point of view of a researcher who has her life engaged with issues of marginality and identity, a note and observation that comes from a colleague of mine, University of Sussex, just to sort of inform you that I'm not alone in feeling at times the kind of pressure that feminists experience when talking about women of religious belief. And she talks about a UK-based researcher. She tells us that since she has started to research inequalities experienced by women of religious belief, fellow feminists have turned their back on her. And she says, yes, she understands the fear of misappropriation, the West, and so on, but she says it is our responsibility to understand minority and marginalized positioning derived from intersections, women's religious identity, gender inequality, socioeconomic exclusion, instead of homogenizing diversely situated women in the pursuit of overarching ideals of emancipation, a positioning that I, can only concur with. So, and it applies to my own situation. I should also say, I can't go into that when because initially my early work had been focused on kinship, concubinage, domestic slavery, Southern China, colonial Hong Kong. And when I shifted to exploration, investigation and research on women as members of marginalized religious minority, I too experienced backlash from colleagues. So that's just a footnote here. So through the lens of a religious, of religious agency, let me give you a brief impressionistic outline of Chinese feminism to set the context a little bit against which I then, within which I situate the work I'm doing. I had initially intended, there's a beautiful poem I translated from Chinese Muslim sister that encapsulates, many of the sort of issues, themes that I shall be talking about. But I won't give myself a time. So if in Q&A anyone were interested, I would be happy to read this very short, it's a beautiful poem, which came out in 1990s, written by Muslim women on their participation, their identity, their dual identity as Chinese citizen and as Muslim women. I want to talk a bit my sort of outline the research, the methodology, research relations, the issue of ethnography and conducting ethnography on sensitive subject under difficult circumstances. And I don't need to spell out what these might be. Let me set the scene. A map of this very complex phenomenon that is Chinese feminism, feminisms. And I'm basing my map on what I consider very, very good scholarship, Xiaowu or Wu Xiao and Dong Yige. That map, which is a kind of seeing Chinese feminism in terms of 5 stages, 5 phases, excludes, of course, the examples that we know of, the exception of, throughout the history of Imperial China, of gifted female poets, writers, artists, excluding these because there were exceptions rather than part of a particular movement, rather than part of something that had a transformative political traction. So talking about movement or incipient movement, the beginning, the first stage would certainly be set at the turn of 20th century, and the names that, many of us familiar with, if there's no other name of the great revolutionary Qiu Jin, who was a participant in the early revolutionary movement that sought to put an end to the imperial system, that sought to modernize the nation, and equated modernization with modernization of women's rights, economic, political, civil rights. This, however, only involved very, very few women of privileged stratum and education. This expanded somewhat involvement numerically and in terms of women from diverse backgrounds when it comes to the Republican era between 1911 to 1949. These are slightly arbitrary cutoff points. That's post-May 4th movement, 1919. That is when largely urban-based professional women, middle-class women, made inroads into professions, education, medical profession, but importantly, where female education started to take off, whether as an indigenous initiative, or whether indeed the many schools set up by missionary societies and so on. So education became extremely important, but again excluded the large, majority of women, the provinces and rural areas. Now this changed then, the third stage, post-1949, the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party state, of which one of its great triumphs, one should say, was the so-called liberation of women and the beginning of social state feminism, of a very close relationship of dependency, you might say, of the All China Women's Federation, which was the only organization seen as representing all women's rights, the dependency of the All China Women's Federation, a so-called handmaiden to the state, campaigning on behalf of the state or enforcing on behalf of the state certain kind of policies, but also participating in extraordinary legal, social achievement that really dismantled many of the heavy strictures, cultural and socio-economic strictures on women. So particularly the early 1950s saw a very extraordinary partnership with All China Women's Federation, which came to an end as prioritization of national consolidation, strengthening of the state, that took priority over women's rights and women's campaigns. And the late 50s up to about the 1970s, the many political campaigns, the Cultural Revolution that served, in a way, the consolidation, the strengthening of the Communist Party state, made women's concern take a back seat. And to some extent, during the 70s, the federation came to a halt altogether and resumed the work in a very different kind of way, during a very different period of greater liberalization following the Cultural Revolution under the regime of Deng Xiaoping. And that is a period that is sort of associated with NGOization. That is, it meant beyond the work done by the All China Women's Federation, there was permission given, the possibility for other semi-independent or altogether independent women interest groups, lobby groups to establish themselves. So under the leadership of academics, activists, reformist members of the All China Women's Federation, many gender equality agendas were set up, research centers, women's studies was incorporated into official curriculum, advisory centers, safe spaces for women subject to domestic violence, campaigns that focus on reproductive health rights and so on, and important anti-domestic violence. Is everything okay? The strange echo, yeah. All this became, I think, a very energetic and strong era of pro-feminist work. But it was also a time when, that was to do with 1995, the Global Women's Conference, many partnerships were established with foreign feminist groups and foreign funding was allowed for. That's quite important because subsequently a backlash blacklisted NGOs to the extent that after 1990s or 2000 and beyond, NGOs found themselves in acute predicaments. Many changed their names because it was suspected of complicity with foreign Western powers in undermining state stability and so on. That was quite an awakening of a different kind, which leads here to what is considered the contemporary, which seen largely shaped by 媒体女性, by internet activism, that's taken away from the rather difficult challenge of confronting and overpowering enormously censorial state to a shift that largely operates within the cultural realm of the concerns about female sexuality, romantic relationship, familial issues. The internet and the nature of the platforms, whether it's Weibo, whether these are apps, allows for bold and challenging gender politics that bypasses the state to deal with local backlash in a way that can be seen very clearly by anyone doing this kind of digital ethnography. It is a much more diverse kind of situation. where it's very, very difficult to define what that feminism is actually constituted of. And as a matter of fact, Dong and Wu suggest that rather than using a kind of Euro or Western-centric framework of feminists confronting, overpowering, fighting a losing battle against the overpowering authoritarian state, to look at local gender politics wherever that happens. And they suggest to look at the importance of what they call a gendered marriage market. So central to the state, given the demographics, given the huge issues to do with the aging population, but also the unintended consequences of one-child family policy. I can't go too much into that, but rather than having women support the loosening of restrictions, the permission given to have 2, if not more children, the refusal on the part of the what's called so-called uncooperative Chinese feminism, women who have got so used to, as you know, lone child, have so used to enjoying life, pursuing their aspirations, having ambitions that might lead to careers, that might lead, to other things, refuse to align themselves with state policies. And this is one of the great sort of issues right now, the issue that we know as 剩女, leftover women, a rather contemptuous term given to women who are seen as sort of having passed expiry date. Women are actually, and this is subversion of that term on the part of these Chinese feminists, are seeing themselves as 剩女, not in the sense of leftover, but as extraordinary and superior women. At the same pronunciation, different character, and a subversion of that kind of meaning. So Dong and Wu suggests that within kind of the contemporary strand of feminism made in China, we would look at what they consider the entrepreneurial strand, that looks at marriage as commercial decision, finds security the best possible marriage, and sees this rather cynically. And talk shows and such dating apps contribute to that. And the other strand being the non-cooperative C-fem, Chinese feminists, desiring sexual autonomy, desiring their own lifestyle. And within that, given that particular perception of these women, they may not necessarily see themselves as feminists, but seen as feminists or perceived as feminists by others, a huge backlash. It's the kind of backlash that I was talking about at the beginning. And a backlash that gives rise to extraordinary trolling, abusive discourse, and so on and so on. And just to mention, the Tangshan incident, the explosion of sexual violence, or the chained woman incident, a woman found chained in a hut, visited by husband, so-called, to give birth to the desired child. I mean, they're really quite extraordinary kind of incidents. But what there is, as there is in our societies, a backlash and a condemnation of women and blaming of these women, holding them responsible for societal ills, all kinds of inequalities, antagonisms that express other and different kind of inequalities that create huge issues. Now, queering, coming then from the sideline, from a marginal kind of lens, however diverse, however complex that map, and which I've only given sort of in outline, so to speak, But what all these feminisms have in common is the exclusion of women, that is, whose religious beliefs, socioeconomic disadvantages, marginalizes them, discriminates against them. So, and it is that the question of who these women who were excluded that interests me. Not only that, the association with religious women that somehow have to do with backwardness, gullibility, superstition, and that's under Harding said in a different context, where modernity or Chinese socialism defined itself on the back of religion. So that these women, members of these religious, major traditions, but also folk religion, would see themselves somehow as the other, as standing for all that which is the time before the party, the Communist Party, liberated those women who were able to unfetter themselves from the fetters of beliefs. So what interested me, therefore, was to find out more about the religious, women's role and part in these religious traditions, the roles they played, the contributions they made within their particular religious culture, but also their negotiation of the particular difficulties given the treatment of religious minorities in case of Islam, which I have studied most. I should also say that most of the major publications in Chinese on women's history have very little reference to these religious traditions. And the notion of religious agency, which after all is also of relatively recent origin in our Western or scholarly discourse, is still an oxymoron within Chinese discourse. And to me, two main reasons why it's important within a Chinese context to understand what that exclusion have meant and how the invisibility women were condemned to also excluded an understanding of the enormity of their and the richness of their life. That first of all, historical reasons, that historically it is a religious sphere within a neo-Confucian society with its extraordinary moral injunctions and gender regime. It is a religious sphere that had historically granted women a degree of choice, of alternatives. And I, can talk about that a little bit more if you're interested in terms of the legitimacy of leaving the house to join a pilgrimage, to go to a temple, to a shrine, to visit a particular mosque, but also more so to make a choice to join a religious order, community. But also, not only historically, the space it opened up to women, and therefore neo-Confucian scholars, denigration and accusation of women, sort of being, gullible and attracted, of course, to all kinds of dreadful things going on in these religious sites. Not only that, demographically also, when you think about the enormous number of believers, across the five, major traditions that are considered legitimate in China. I mean, these are conservative sort of figures. It goes between 200, 350 million members of the five major traditions: Taoism, Buddhism, Catholicism, Islam, Protestantism. But beyond that, also the enormous number of people adhering to folk religions, not taken into what's called the legitimate religiosity. So these are huge numbers, huge percentage of women believing. So to me, that invisibility was provoking me, needed greater understanding, particularly as when at that time, as I was involved with much more mainstream scholarship in China at that time, and when it became clear that I was going to shift my work to the intersection of gender equality and religious inequality, I came in for quite a lot of flack, a lot of criticism on the part of my Chinese colleague of, ignoring what is progressive and enlightened and so on in Chinese women's history and turning again the association to things that were and are backward and superstition. So how did I come to that? It was in living for a time in central China, in Henan and so on, making excursions, taking my walks and so on, that I discovered a reference to Qingzhen Nusi, women's mosque, to which I had no scholarly reference, nothing, no record. And it is that discovery, together with a meeting with a foremost Hui Muslim sociologist of religion, Shui, who became my research partner and colleague, that led me then to a very different road of investigation and discovery, of collaboration and of storytelling. What was it that we needed to look at? We were first of all intrigued by the uniqueness of women's part in organized Islam, that is Sunni Islam I'm talking about. Mostly among Hui Muslims are one of 10 ethnic minorities that constitute the Muslim population in China, and it is the most populous and the most perhaps accommodating in terms of its closeness to Han Chinese culture. So it is where I found myself that we discovered historically the first women's Quranic schools were, set up, and eventually women's mosques came to be institutionalized, so to speak. So our inquiry was into the origin of these particular mosques that goes back hundreds of years, to discover that the history of women education within Islam is hundreds of years of history. So at a time when in surrounding areas, women were largely illiterate, had no schooling, as we've just heard, before mid-20th century, rural, ordinary Muslim women would, by virtue of needing to educate themselves in rudimentary religious knowledge, in enormously fundamental passages from the Quran and so on, acquire learning. It may have been simply of rudimentary kind of Arabic, Persian language, and of a knowledge also of a world beyond their village, their county, beyond their country. So this a fascinating evolution from the beginnings that signaled this 16th century and so on, late Ming, early Qing China, where it seemed there was a danger that Islam would be erased from memory, where a huge cultural Islamic project necessitated a reform of Islamic education, reform of mosque organization. It was realized without the women, we can't flourish. So from these beginnings to, and very ad hoc, private education, instruction of women, to institutionalization of mosque-based education, of a multiplicity of functions of fixed venues that became mosques, with trained professional teachers and imams, and indeed the establishment of female imam, that is quite rare within the Ummah, within the Muslim world. That evolution we try to trace, and became absolutely fascinating account also of the female leadership, of the professionalization of the imamate, of the ability during the times of crisis, during the difficult political years of particularly between the 1950s and 70s and 80s, in understanding of the skill, the negotiation skills, the wisdom, the strategic thinking that enabled these particular religious sites to survive, to go underground, but to re-emerge as a greater liberalization in the 1990s enabled the reconstitution of religious culture and religious organization. So we looked at the history, the origin, the history, the important sociology of religious space, the relationship with other institutions. We looked at them within a extraordinary religious pluralism that very often is not associated with China, which I talk about in a moment when I show the final images. But we came, and this is the current work we're doing, to admire the extraordinary continuity of what we call the expressive culture of women's mosques, that over nearly 400 years of female-centered learning and worship and female-led institutions, a tradition of chants had been preserved, Jingge, Islamic chants that served many extraordinary purposes, didactic purposes, purposes of worship, of prayer, of collective celebration. And it is these particular chants, the salvaging of these chants that had never been recorded, that brought about what we call a social movement. That is, in trying to recover and trying to discover memory of these chants that older members of Muslim communities still remember having learned as little girls in these mosques, we involved whole communities of women, mosque-based communities and their leaders, their ahum, all transforming from informants, respondents, to become co-researchers, because as they were saying, this isn't just about you publishing your books, and we publish both in English and Chinese, I must say. This is our story. This is what we, have to find out. We have to preserve. That's our legacy. So it is with the help over 4 or 5 years, in the third book, a trilogy of books on Islam, gender in China, that we have been able to salvage, recover, record, transcribe, and annotate hundreds of these chants that in part, are now interpreted, become more academic publications that, give us access to understanding of religious subjectivity and emotionality on the one hand, but also that has become a compilation of chants textbook now available in all women's mosques for a preservation and for a continuation of this wonderful tradition of collective chanting. And around that, for me of interest was both the support granted by a great many, not only Muslims, but scholars, activists who saw that as an extraordinary rich and known contribution, not only to Islamic history in China, but also to Chinese history and cultural history. The extraordinary support given also from male imams and men's mosques. Having said that, there was also backlash and contestations over the possible violation of Islamic injunctions. So, both the movement and the debate and the discourse around this giving us an understanding of the extraordinary nature, the uniqueness of women's Islamic tradition, expressive culture, but also their contribution to what we consider the diversity of Islam that exists within the wider Ummah. And I want to sort of just finish by showing you simply of where it is that we were working and some of the sites work and collaborators. And here you can see Henan right at the center, south of Beijing, the Central Plains, the cradle of Chinese civilization, so to speak, and south of the Yellow River. Just to sort of, again, tell you a little bit about the extraordinary richness of culture and religious tradition, which one doesn't always associate with China, but which has been part of its history in this small part, old part of the city of Kaifeng in Henan, where we conducted much of our field work, where you see the sort of yellow sort of dots. You have different religious traditions, all female-centered, female-led. The Taoist temple, and let me go on to that here, a Jikumiao Taoist temple, in the neighborhood of women's mosque, in the neighborhood of a female-led Buddhist temple. Here, the images of the older senior leaders of this Taoist temple, some of the indication of the richness and the enormous vitality of religious culture that surrounds the Taoist site, and here the senior leader. Just to say, when a highly educated, erudite woman asking why she chose a religious profession, certainly not in a very supportive kind of societal environment, her brief, remark was, 自由 is all I wanted, independence away from female life cycles, family, messiness, as she called it, and so on. Here, this is a Catholic brochure, again, of the same quarter. At the front, a Catholic church. This was much supported. These particular Catholic church, supported by a particular American missionary project. But if you look closely at the back, you see the silhouette of mosques. So all these different traditions existed in neighborhood, and still at this particular point in time are very close. Here, Sisters of Providence. This is just very briefly. I'm only putting this up because what is fascinating is that some of local young Catholics, and this is a tradition that goes back into the early 20th century, were not too keen on the discipline of convents, particularly led by what they consider very severe American nuns, and chose to lead celibate lives away in their family homes. And that was completely acceptable, not so much by the Catholic Church. It is the institution of virgins, or Chinese virgins they were called, exists into this day. And I conclude with just a brief images here of the current work to which I've referred to, the recovery of these amazing, the expressive tradition, the soundscape, we call it, of women's mosque. This is the oldest documented women's mosque in Henan, going back as far as 1820. And great importance here, woman imam. This is the prayer hall where often we had many conversations at on Juba prayer day, women's mosque. Again, of great importance, largely due to the erudition in the black scarf there, erudition of an old imam, woman imam, whose mastery of Arabic, Persian, and Chinese was unrivaled. Here she's again sitting alongside her colleagues. And briefly here, a phenomenon of very recent years would have been unthinkable before that. The now very popular
It's okay. Sometimes you hear maybe someone.
Yeah, the very, sort of beloved, sort of very popular tradition of coming together, performing together, celebrating women's voices in front of gender mixed audiences, quite extraordinary too. And just a picture, so you see me enveloped in a scarf, recording, some of the chants, and the younger generation waiting to perform. And I stop with this image of, that extraordinary immersion, in prayer and meditation as they listen to the recitation of the Quran. An image I took just a few years ago, and I stop at that. All right, okay.
Yeah, and thank you really for your amazing presentation, and there's like a lot of things that we can like go and discuss more because we see that there is like a lot of interesting points to discuss. However, we just collected a few questions. Like, since we don't really have enough time to answer all the questions, I will pick just 3 or 4 like that I will find. They're mostly asking also similar things. So the first question is regarding like how, like what was the level of schooling where these women, like Islamic women, were facing, and what, how having like a female ahon, so a female imam, influenced their perception of knowledge and getting to know more about Islam, but also like learning more from school. This is the first question.
Thank you. Yes, this is a very good question. It sort of is a 2-part question. One is to do with the educational level of women sort of in general, and opportunities given, and the second one has to do with the leadership. This is really quite an extraordinary institution. I know that, some of the imams and so on I talked to here in Oxford, they were utterly astounded at that being, a recognized legitimate status, although there too is a backlash for recent times. In terms of, this was the point that I was making. When you look sort of a mainstream, feminism and the way that there's a kind of condescension, even worse, in terms of what these what these religious women life were like, their gullibility, these kind of easy prejudices associated with these women. And when you look at the actual history of these extraordinary institutions that evolved over time from ad hoc private kind of instruction, teaching, from behind curtains and so on, to more permanent sites with multiple functions, congregation worship, ablution, learning, and so on. These spaces became extraordinary sources of not only learning, but also of solidarity, of identity, in a way that's really quite extraordinary. But also for these women who were able to leave their home in order to go to a mosque, in order to join particular collective prayer, the sort of outside world opened up in a great many ways. Yes, the learning, you could say, was fairly rudimentary. Yes, there were, particularly what was referred to as the women's Quran, extracted passages from the Quran to do with family morality, women's ethic, and largely concerned with duties that women had as Muslim wives and mothers in order to bring up families in the proper way, and so on and so on. But somehow the opening up to a world out there, I mean, this was constantly also in interviews and many conversations with women, that sense that, yes, they may be in a small women's, mosque in a village, and it may, yes, they may not have got very far, but somehow they feel themselves to be part of a wider world of the Ummah. And the education brought that home to them. And it was the service, the extraordinary ability, capacities of these trained, in the end, properly ordained women ahong, on whom women completely depended, because being illiterate, their only access to the scriptural language, the writing, was through being taught by the ahong. And she taught largely through chanting, the repetition that enabled memorizing and rota learning. But you only learned, you only respected those whom you considered to be of integrity, of erudition. So this wasn't just gullibility, either dependency on anyone of higher learning. The women, the very ordinary women, and I think that is the case now as it was then, who would talk about their teacher, their ahong in a particular way, were also able to explain what made for the respect they held the ahong in, for the integrity, for the uncorruptibility, and so on and so on. So that was enormously important relationship, is what fascinated us. And we've.
I'd like to reflect to what you had just said, that they feel themselves like connected to like a bigger Umrah. Is there any big difference you can remark in the way of living between the Hui Muslim community and other communities in China or in the world?
And other Muslim communities in China? That's a very interesting question, because when we started our work on the origins, evolution of women's learning or sites of learning, they weren't from the start mosques, they were considered, sort of private homeschooling or madrasas, schools, etc., etc. What became very clear is that it was initially confined to central China. That is where some of the early Hui scholars were, trying to strategize about the need to save, salvage, preserve the faith of Islam in these central Chinese provinces. And it is there that they felt women had a role to play as primary educators, that faith could be lost easily if women, mothers and wives, were not able to teach rudimentaries of faith. So it was an entirely pragmatic decision to incorporate women into that cultural movement, that project. But unintended consequence, and that fascinated us, what happened in the course of this, evolution, the institutionalization, of, particular functions, authorities, sites, was not foreseen, because what was segregated site because of Islamic and Neo-Confucian injunctions became sites of transformation, used by women as a source of strength, to bargain, particularly after the 1990s and becoming into contemporary period, to bargain for legal, registration, for more recognition, for more resources, and for, sources of income. So, this is quite an extraordinary kind of evolution, and that is where the notion of agency here comes into that. These weren't women passively, learning their prayer, and these were women who saw themselves as active members of a faith precariously situated, where they had a part to play, an important and supportive part, and in the process became extraordinarily, we feel, strong and proactive and capable negotiators of their faith and the fate of their communities.
We have another question also from Alejandro Cordero from European Guardsy. He's asking, like, regarding the Chinese social evolution in recent years, as well as the influence of social media in the Chinese general society, how are the younger generation of Hui Muslim women challenging and reshaping traditional gender roles? Is there intergenerational difference in expectation within their communities?
Yes, definitely generational differences. And I think that to some extent, these generational differences are shared with other kind of communities.
Like in the world, in every community.
Negotiating and so on. It is true to say, I've been talking, I have to be careful, I've been talking largely about Hui Muslim communities. It's one of the 10 ethnic minorities. It is the largest, and in terms of cultural, sort of influences, perhaps, rather important at the forefront of it. So when I talk about mosques, they were present historically in certain other ethnic minorities, but by no means all. And there are the Bao'an, Dongxiang Muslim minorities in northwest China, much more restrictive, much more closed than the Hui communities, where even the introduction of social media, internet, would be considered haram, forbidden, in terms of women using these. And we've had a great many, particular research trips to sort of look at these, kind of differences. Whereas in Hui communities, absolutely, the younger generation, they go out to work, they have to find, their employment. There is much more mixing interaction with non-Muslim neighbors. There are some entirely Hui Muslim communities, but there are also a great deal of mixed neighborhoods, and I think a much more mutual understanding there, a much more liberal also understanding of also choices made by younger generation. Hugely important, because social media enables you to, if you, for example, we found that in Shanghai, are not pleased with the educational standard quality of your ahong, you go onto the internet and you seek out which preacher you prefer. You go on the internet and you go to particular websites. We heard that again and again, and the complaints from certain ahong or mosques who felt that their congregation was dwindling because they were considered too closely wedded to particular orthodoxies. So it's enormously challenging, but perhaps most importantly in certain cities, urban areas, Shanghai, Beijing, and so on, where perhaps some of the issues, are a little bit, sensitive and difficult because of the different, fundamentalisms and austerities that sort of crept in, and rather critical of what's called accommodating mainstream, Muslim culture. So where I'm talking about, I constantly have to say, I am in the central Chinese region, perhaps the most, accommodating. Although in these particular times, that's certainly no longer, something, a statement I easily make.
So to close up, I will invite now also Lisa Kulzani. She wanted to ask a question by herself. So Lisa, you can open your camera and you can...
Okay, it's lovely to see your face.
Hello, Professor. I wanted to say thank you because it was really interesting. And I wanted to ask you a specific question about discrimination, because I found that on the religious aspect, sometimes the general Chinese society can be quite discriminating. So I wanted to ask, did you find that the Hui minority was discriminated or was accepted into society by the general Chinese who are usually atheist or Buddhist? So this is quite interesting.
No, it depends a little bit which moment of time I'm talking about this. You know, if I think in the early 1950s, the degree of, you know, sort of flexibility meant that actually these women's mosques were able to reform themselves, bring in reform also of their education and so on, were more or less left to their own devices. And then, of course, Cultural Revolution, everything else closed down. You know, there we have the religious venues made religious life impossible. It went, what there was went underground, and the persecution of particular religious leaders and so on, you know, is quite well known, ended up house arrest, internment camps, and worse. When I did my research, what's interesting, you know, I mentioned how colleagues sort of reacted to the fact that I, you know, was changing, you know, from looking at kinship and concubinage and so on, you know, it's something else that intrigued me because of the invisibility, because of that exclusion of these women. I mean, that reaction showed me how, and this is, we're talking highly educated academics, women who see themselves as feminists, you have that assumption there. In part, it's also the Marxist, kind of influence about the nature of emancipation, as largely Enlightenment, based and secularist. In part, the discrimination, against an entire lifestyle that can come to the fore from time to time, in particular violent. There are occasionally, even in those communities where I research, which I see as largely accommodating, there are occasionally violent incidents that would occur, particular, you know, accusations that would very quickly become, you know, turn to collective violence. So yes, there is that reservation there when it comes to religion, simply because of the conviction that modernity and socialism and so on must be evolving on the back of something else. That somehow, you know, in many of the interviews I did with highly educated colleagues, but particularly with bureaucrats and officials, that sense that the market for religion can last only insofar as there is gullibility, the gullible consumers, and those tend to be women. So it's largely women, you know, associated with that particular gullibility. Discrimination in terms of, yes, other things, dress code to some extent, although in central China where I work, you tend to wear head covering only when you go to a mosque or prayer. So it is not part of your daily, perhaps dress. But yes, I absolutely, when you wear a particular hijab, also in dress, the dress code, observed dress code, you are certainly encountering particular statements, you know, that put it mildly, that, you know, sort of jokingly comment on your, sort of, well, traditionalism, but they can be nasty as well. So that's the interesting part. The question that we had, why is it that young women choose to wear, you know, particular headdress? And so it's never the full nikah. I mean, it's just a headdress and maybe a long, modest garment. Then you have a different kind of question. What is it that makes these particular women from that younger generation make a choice that so clearly will bring them inconvenience, sometimes discrimination? And I think that is an expression of their particular agency, of their commitment to a piety, a faith that, you know, they feel matters so much. And it brings, you know, forth as extraordinary kind of courage that, you know, I think brings, you know, on my part, a huge amount of respect, actually. So you have both. You have discrimination on the one hand, you have people sort of shying away from showing themselves to, to the outside world as believing members. But you also have, in the younger generation, a readiness to expose your identity. Having said that, at the moment, given the current political situation, I think there is caution on all sides, whether in terms of discrimination or in terms of, the manifestation, of identity.
Thank you very much for questions, and thank you, Professor Maria Jaschok, for your really interesting insights and your explanations, and for your patience for answering to all these questions in just this little time we had to share together.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, so much to say and so little time. Yeah.
I mean, we also have to close up. We could stay here and ask you a lot of questions, but we know that we can take your time more. So we have to stop here. Otherwise, we go for an extra hour of discussion and will be really interesting. So we hope to have this opportunity to talk with you again in maybe other occasions. So thank you really again for accepting our invitation, for being here tonight with us and sharing your research, your interest. And for me, it was a great pleasure. And I hope also the people enjoyed this webinar. And also I hope you enjoyed it as well as we did, as much as we did, okay?
And thank you very much again for inviting me, for sharing, the eve of International Women's Day. And I hope that we needn't be quite as pessimistic as the United Nations Secretary General and wait 300 odd years or so for gender equality to come. So it seems unduly pessimistic, perhaps. So thank you very much. And I wish everyone, a good samba, a good International Women's Day. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have also people thanking you in the chat. So have a nice evening for the rest of the evening, and hope to meet you in other occasions.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, right. Good night to everyone.